In this section, we'll look at some of the reasons why the African American civil rights movement really took off in the 1950s. We'll step back and look at some of the general reasons. Certainly, Truman's embrace of African American civil rights was a major cause in launching the modern civil rights movement. It gave him momentum. World War II and Truman sort of laid the foundation for further advances. But by the 1950s, the U.S. Supreme Court was also becoming a major engine of change. By the 1950s, jurists appointed by the liberal Roosevelt had supplanted the more conservative justices appointed by the Republican presidents during the 1920s. Now, rather than interpreting the Constitution in strict constructionist terms, if it doesn't say the federal government can do it, it can't, the court read the Constitution more as a legal realist, in legal realist terms, considering the impact of law on society. If it doesn't say the federal government can't do it, it can. This shift in constitutional interpretation led the court to question earlier decisions such as the 1894 case, Plessy versus Ferguson. That infamous case, of course, decided a half-century before, stated that segregation and Jim Crow were constitutional and thus acceptable. One of the first cases foretelling reform was right at the end of World War II, Smith versus Allwright. As a mechanism for disenfranchising African Americans, many state Democratic parties in the South had denied African Americans the right to participate in party functions, including the primaries to select the party's candidate. Smith versus Allwright declared it unconstitutional for political parties to deny full participation based on race. In 1950, the case Sweat versus Painter declared that a separate school of law run by the state of Texas could never be equal to the prestigious University of Texas School of Law. The court, therefore, ordered the admission of African Americans to UT's law school. That same year, the court held in the case of McLaurin versus the University of Oklahoma that placing African American desks behind barriers in classrooms or at separate tables in the lunchroom was unconstitutional. Both cases strongly foretold that, all separate educational facilities were unconstitutional. In addition to the pressure from the Supreme Court, another force for reform was integration of professional baseball. Now, for decades, there have been two professional baseball leagues, the Major Leagues for whites and the Negro Leagues for African Americans. Segregationists insisted that African American baseball was inferior, but the Major League's Brooklyn Dodgers thought that the star of the Negro League's Kansas City Monarchs, the 28-year-old Jackie Robinson, could help them. The Dodgers general manager, Branch Rickey, realized that if he took Robinson would face tremendous abuse from racist fans, and therefore got Robinson to promise to take the abuse quietly, sort of the turn the other cheek. Robinson made his major league debut in Ebbets Field on April 15, 1947, playing in front of 26,000 spectators, which included 14,000 African Americans. Robinson earned Rookie of the Year, and true to his promise to Rickey, he remained quiet in the face of much abuse. This apparently classy response, together with Robinson's great play, advanced integration. The success of baseball encouraged other professions to integrate and helped dispose the myth of black inferiority. Of course, another force for reform was the growth of organized civil rights groups. Not only was the granddaddy of civil rights organizations, the NAACP, active, but new organizations formed as well. In 1942, during World War II, African Americans in Chicago formed the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, led by James Farmer. It sought to highlight and address the problems of the new black arrivals in the northern urban communities. 15 years later, a young black minister from Boston University, newly arrived at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. Both groups, along with a number of others, sought to utilize nonviolent protest to advance African American rights, and they all proved vital in providing the organization and coordination that the modern civil rights movement demanded. One of perhaps the greatest factors encouraging the modern civil rights movement was the spread of television. At the end of World War II, there were less than 5,000 television sets nationally. But by the end of the 1950s, almost 90% of American homes had TVs. When the nonviolent protest of the civil rights organizations frequently met with violence, the sympathy of many viewers turned to the civil rights movement. Television gave the civil rights movement the moral high ground. television's impact was really profound on American culture in many respects, but its role in encouraging support for the African American civil rights movement was one of its greatest contributions. This includes the section on some of the general reasons why the African American civil rights movement grew in the 1950s.